Okay, last time I may have dropped out of my West Texas mode for a moment and become a little too philosophical, so I'm going to try to restate a few themes from Nietzsche in a simple way, quickly, before I move on to some remarks about Kierkegaard. What I was trying to evoke in you was more the spirit of Nietzsche than the specific text. The spirit of Nietzsche is one of deep suspicion, and that suspicion is that power is intertwined with things that we normally like to think of even today as not being dependent on power. For example, truth, goodness, and so on. Nietzsche says they are. Now, Nietzsche says, and he uses historical models, since we've already made remarks that real history is material, and philosophers generally use sort of ideographic and very brief descriptions of historical periods, mainly to make points about them. Whether the Greeks were really like that is another issue, very, very troubling and problematic issue. But for Nietzsche, the Greeks had a kind of straightforward idea of virtue based on excellence, which I discussed in the very first lecture on Socrates. Excellence was to fulfill your human powers, so that among those would be that if you had desires, the ability to meet them was quite important to being excellent. Excellent people wouldn't be filled with resentment and envy because mostly when they tried to exercise a human power, they would be able to and meet their need. Now, for Nietzsche, the Christian morality that grew out of a slave context, and this is not meant to be a criticism of the slaves, and the only sense in which I used it as a criticism of Christianity was as Christianity as a public religion, and there's where I made my political points. But the slave aspect of Christianity meant that its doctrines of love and compassion were rooted in the resentment of a power that could not exercise itself. One of the things slaves have a problem with is that they have powers too, but are constrained from exercising them. Christianity, therefore, on Nietzsche's account, part of its function was compensatory, to compensate for that power you don't have in this one, in this world, by projecting a power in another one, by loving people in this world, but the thematic underneath it, its motivation, that's what Nietzsche argued was resentment, hatred, and so on. That made it all the more important to cloak those motives in a dialogue of love. Just as one has a political doctrine of greed, best to cloak it in a political language of freedom and choice. Greed doesn't sell as well as freedom, choice, and points of light. So that's my quick recap of Nietzsche. He's to make us suspicious even about what people think they really believe. That was another point. On the other side of resentment, however, is religion as resistance. So I've had some very helpful questions on that, and religion also serves this function, and now I'm referring back to some famous remarks of Karl Marx's about religion not only stupefies, that's the remark about religion being the opium of the people. Marx didn't live long enough to know that today opium is the opium of the people. We're materialists now like him. Today, you got a whole bunch of dissatisfied people. Their opium is opium. It's more effective as opium. Real opium is. It's really opium. But religion had this dual significance, that while the resentment was there was also resistance and rebellion. In other words, it was a form of resistance to power, and therefore itself a what? A power. So that's where Nietzsche's account becomes complicated in regard to power. But if anything is shocking about Nietzsche, it's to look at these doctrines that are considered about the holy, the good, the true, the right, and the virtuous, and analyze them in terms of power. So that's a brief recap of what I've said about Nietzsche. I was also asked to explain, and I guess you always are, Nietzsche's famous remark. He was not the first to make it. Hegel was the first to make the remark, God is dead, in a certain context, but Nietzsche is best known for saying God is dead. And my way of treating that is not like other philosophers. I took Nietzsche to be making something like a sociological point, a point about society. Nietzsche's trying to tell us something, and this is to go back to remarks I have made earlier too, about the condition of the modern world, where our lives are fragmented into a work week and then a festival day called Saturday. Well, that's if you're not doing the work left over from the week, or you don't have the neighbors over, when it just becomes more work. No, you may like your neighbors. I don't know. But anyway, the work week and Sunday is a sort of separate, segmented day set off for religion, when, in Nietzsche's view, in mine, and according to, as it were, the guiding principles of the religious way of life itself, could not, by the very nature of the case, be religion. So the remark that God is dead is a remark about how society has changed. Nietzsche, in his famous parable where he discusses this, said that you and I have killed him. That's, God is dead and you and I have killed him. In other words, we've ceased to live a life centered around God. And he makes a shocking and I think brilliant remark when he says, what are these churches today if they are not the tombs and the sepulchres of God? They give the best evidence to his death. These churches, these creeds, what are they but his tombs? So Nietzsche's remark is about a culture that can't truly be centered in the holy way of, in a religious, holy way of life anymore. Not that there aren't any more believers that really believe, okay, it's not that, but that the culture has segmented into one facet of life, something that by its very nature should permeate the whole of life. Because if there's a God, it clearly would permeate the whole of our lives, be the point of them. And that's the sense in which that God at the center of the world is dead, and what's in his place are other world systems, economic, political, and I discussed those too. So that for me is the meaning of the remark, God is dead. Of course, at one level, it's a paradox, because if you were an atheist, you would think it was a strange remark, because what sense does it make to say something died that never was there in the first place? So that's why I take it to be a historical, sociological style remark, is because gods and our gods are immanent inside, as it were, cultures, tribes, and so on, not somewhere above them and outside them. So Nietzsche's remark is that in our tribe, that myth has lost its power to bind us all. Now, many modern conservatives wish we had it back. Daniel Bell argues that an answer to America's problems is a rebirth of religion, but almost everything counts against that in a society divided, where labor is divided the way ours is, and where the first thing that would happen if we had a rebirth of it would be experts in it, specialists, and new TV shows about it, which is where we get on to Kierkegaard and his brilliant attempt to try to save more than Christianity as a personal, singular relation with something else about which Kierkegaard won't say much. But what he calls what I will call his attack on Christendom, and it's not so different than Nietzsche's. Kierkegaard is the author of a famous remark, and he says, in a country where, or in a place where all are Christians, ipso facto none are Christians. He reminds us that the gospel, the challenging gospel that arguably someone like Martin Luther King took probably too seriously, not in my view, but in the view of some, that arguably there it would be dangerous